An Invitation to Social Psychology. Alan Turing, a British mathematician, logician, and philosopher, is generally considered to be the founder of computer science. During World War II, Turing was head of Hut-8, the British government agency responsible for breaking the Enigma code of the German Navy, an accomplishment that contributed greatly to the Allied war effort. In January 1952, when Turing was 39, he was arrested for gross indecency, a term the British used for homosexual conduct. Turing was convicted of the charge and allowed to choose between imprisonment and chemical castration to reduce his libido and cause impotence. He chose the latter punishment, which involved the administration of female hormones. Turing attempted to come to the United States but was considered a security risk and not allowed to enter. Until 1974, the American Psychiatric Association held that homosexuality was a mental illness. On June 8, 1954, Turing was found dead from cyanide poisoning in his apartment. The death was ruled a suicide. At the time of Turing's death, homosexuality was illegal in most U.S. states. It wasn't until 2003 that the U.S. Supreme Court reversed a previous decision and declared that homosexual conduct was permitted under the Due Process Clause of the 14th Amendment. Thereupon, all laws in the United States criminalizing homosexual acts became invalid. Until 1994, homosexuality was a sufficient cause for discharge from the American military. President Clinton issued an order prohibiting discrimination against homosexual members of the armed forces, but also barring openly gay people who demonstrate a propensity or intent to engage in homosexual acts from serving in the armed forces. This "don't ask, don't tell" ruling was overturned in 2011 by President Obama, and openly gay, lesbian, and bisexual individuals can now serve in the armed forces. For years, public opinion ran strongly against same-sex marriage until a recent and surprisingly rapid shift toward it. In 1996, a small minority of Americans favored gay marriage. Less than 20 years later, a solid majority supported the Supreme Court's decision to legalize marriage equality nationwide. The American public went from viewing homosexuality as an illegal act and a mental illness possibly requiring surgical intervention to acceptance of marriage equality in scarcely more than a generation. This fact, and many others concerning homosexuality in relation to social norms and individual psychology, are the kinds of topics that deeply interest social psychologists. Why was homosexuality seen as such a threat to people in modern Western societies? In many cultures, homosexuality never was considered abnormal or reprehensible or even particularly worthy of notice. In others, it has been punishable by death since time immemorial. Why has homosexuality in women in virtually every society always been more tolerated than homosexuality in men? To what degree is same-sex attraction, or sexual orientation in general, influenced by social norms and institutional settings? How is it possible for an entire society to significantly change its attitudes toward a salient social issue in less than 20 years? What are the effects on sexual minorities of societal rejection versus the effects of acceptance? How and why do stereotypes of gay, lesbian, and bisexual people change over time? How do sexual minority cultures and subcultures change over time? And what are the factors that influence such changes? Outline: characterizing social psychology, the power of the situation, the role of construal, automatic versus controlled processing, evolution and human behavior, how are we the same, culture and human behavior, how are we different, the uses of social psychology. Why have social attitudes toward sexual orientation changed over time? Why are we quicker to blame a person's behavior on their dispositions than on situational influences? Why would people follow orders to mistreat others? In this chapter, we explain what social psychology is and what social psychologists study. We also present some of the basic concepts of social psychology, especially the surprising degree to which social situations can influence behavior. The role of construal, or the interpretive processes people use to understand situations, and how two different kinds of thinking, one rapid, intuitive, and unconscious, and the other slower, analytical, and conscious, both contribute to understanding what is happening in social situations. We also describe some relatively recent developments in social psychology that have changed the field, namely, the application of evolutionary concepts to human behavior, the use of the tools of neuroscience, and the discovery of some significant variations in human cultures that frequently lead people in diverse societies to respond to the same situation in very different ways. Changing attitudes toward homosexuality. Same sex marriage is now legal in the United States, and adoption of children by same sex couples is legal in many states. Openly gay, bisexual, and lesbian politicians, such as Tammy Baldwin, are being elected to national political office. Characterizing social psychology. People have always sought explanations for human behavior. Stories, parables, and folk wisdom have been passed from generation to generation to explain why people do what they do and to prescribe behaviors to avoid or follow. Social psychologists go beyond folk wisdom and try to establish a scientific basis for understanding human behavior. Social psychology can be defined as the scientific study of the feelings, thoughts, and behaviors of individuals in social situations. Why are people inclined to stereotype members of different groups? Why do people risk their lives to help others? Why do some marriages flourish and others fail? How do orderly crowds turn into violent mobs? These sorts of questions lie at the heart of social psychology, and careful research has provided at least partial answers to all of them. Some of the answers probably won't surprise you. For example, we tend to like people who like us, and the people we are like generally have attitudes and interests that are similar to ours. When experimental findings reflect what our intuition and folk wisdom say will happen, social psychologists go further, seeking to discover what lies behind the phenomenon in question. In contrast, other answers have been so counterintuitive that they surprised even the social psychologists who conducted the research. As you will see throughout this book, many of our most strongly held folk theories or intuitions fail to give complete answers to important questions, and others are just plain wrong. Social psychologists test these intuitions by devising studies and crafting experiments that reveal the causes of behavior in social situations. Social psychology, the scientific study of the feelings, thoughts, and behaviors of individuals in social situations. The test of learning psychology is whether your understanding of situations you encounter has changed, not whether you have learned a new fact. Nobel Prize winning psychologist Daniel Kahneman. Explaining behavior. In April 2004, more than a year after the start of the war in Iraq, CBS broadcast a story that exposed American atrocities against Iraqi prisoners in the Abu Ghraib prison near Baghdad. CBS showed photos of naked prisoners with plastic bags over their heads, stacked up in a pyramid and surrounded by laughing American soldiers. Other photos showed hooded prisoners standing on narrow pedestals, with their arms stretched out and electric wires attached to their bodies. CBS also reported that prisoners had been required to simulate sexual acts. The reaction on the part of many Iraqis and others in the Arab world was to regard the soldiers' behavior as evidence that the United States had malevolent intentions toward Arabs. Most Americans, too, were appalled at the abuse and ashamed of the behavior of the U.S. soldiers. Many people assumed that the soldiers who had perpetrated these acts were bad apples, exceptions to a rule of common decency prevailing in the military and the general population. Social psychologists, however, weren't so quick to make such an assumption. Indeed, 30 years before the atrocities at Abu Ghraib, Philip Zimbardo and his colleagues paid 24 Stanford University undergraduate men, chosen for their good character and mental health, to be participants in a study of a simulated prison. The researchers flipped a coin to determine who would be a guard and who would be a prisoner. The guards wore green fatigue uniforms and reflective sunglasses. The prisoners wore tunics with nylon stocking caps and had a chain locked around one ankle. The prison was set up in the basement of the psychology department, and the researchers anticipated that the study would last 2 weeks. Right away, the guards turned to verbal abuse and physical humiliation, requiring the prisoners to wear bags over their heads, stripping them naked, and requiring them to engage in simulated sex acts. As a result, the study had to be terminated after 6 days because the behavior of the guards produced extreme stress reactions in several of the prisoners. Prison situations and intimidation. A. Military guards at the Abu Ghraib prison in Iraq used torture, humiliation, and intimidation to try to obtain information from the prisoners. This included stripping them and making them lie naked in the prison corridors. B. Such degradation echoes what happened in the Zimbardo prison study, as shown in this photo of a guard seeking to humiliate one of his prisoners at the simulated prison. Zimbardo today maintains that the balance of power in prisons is so unequal that they tend to be brutal places unless the guards observe strict regulations curbing their worst impulses. Thus, at both Abu Ghraib and Stanford, it's not that we put bad apples in a good barrel, we put good apples in a bad barrel. The barrel corrupts anything that it touches. Some might contend that the soldiers in Iraq were only following orders and that, left to their own devices, they would not have chosen to behave as they did. That may be the case, but it then leads us to ask, why did they follow such orders? Social psychologists try to find answers to just such questions. They study situations in which people exert influence over one another, as well as the ways people respond to various attempts to influence them. Social psychologists are also interested in how people make sense of their world, how they decide what and whom to believe, how they make inferences about the motives, personalities, and abilities of other people, and how they reach conclusions about the causes of events. Social psychologists apply their knowledge to important questions concerning individuals and society at large. How to reduce stereotyping and prejudice in the classroom and workplace, how to make eyewitness testimony more reliable, how physicians can best use diverse sources of information to make a correct diagnosis, what goes wrong in airplane cockpits when there is an accident or near accident, and how businesses, governments, and individuals can make better decisions. By the time you finish this book, you will have acquired a greater understanding of yourself and others. You will also have knowledge that you can apply in your education, your career, and your relationships. Your reasoning and the quality of your life will improve accordingly. Kurt Lewin. Lewin is generally considered the founder of modern social psychology. He emphasized the importance of situational factors external to the individual and showed that social psychologists could make use of experiments. The power of the situation. Kurt Lewin, the founder of modern social psychology, was a Jewish Berliner who fled Nazi Germany in the 1930s and became a professor at the University of Iowa and then at MIT. Lewin was knowledgeable about physics, and he applied a powerful idea from physics to an understanding of psychological existence. He believed that the behavior of people, like the behavior of objects, is always a function of the field of forces in which they find themselves. To understand how fast a solid object will travel through a medium, for example, we must know such things as the viscosity of the medium, the force of gravity, and any initial force applied to the object. In the case of people, the forces are psychological as well as physical. The field of forces, in the case of human behavior, is the situation, especially the social situation. Of course, a person's attributes are also important determinants of behavior, but these attributes always interact with the situation to produce the resulting behavior. The main situational influences on our behavior are the actions, and sometimes just the mere presence, of other people. Friends, romantic partners, even total strangers can cause us to be kinder or meaner, smarter or dumber, lazier or more hardworking, bolder or more cautious. They can produce drastic changes in our beliefs and behavior, not only by what they tell us explicitly, but also by showing through their actions what we should think and do, by subtly implying that our acceptability as a friend or group member depends on adapting their views or behaving as they do. All these effects have been shown in numerous studies demonstrating the power of the situation. The Milgram experiment. One of the most striking demonstrations of the power of the situation is a classic experiment by psychologist Stanley Milgram, 1963-1974. Milgram advertised in the local newspaper for men to participate in a study on learning and memory at Yale University in exchange for a modest amount of money. In subsequent experiments, women also participated. The results were similar. When the volunteers, a mix of laborers, middle-class individuals, and professionals ranging in age from their 20s to their 50s, arrived at the laboratory, a man in a white lab coat told them they would be participating in a study about the effects of punishment on learning. There would be a teacher and a learner, and the learner would try to memorize word pairs such as wild duck. The volunteer and another man, a somewhat heavy-set, pleasant-looking man in his late 40s, drew slips of paper to determine who would play which role. But things were not as they seemed. The pleasant-looking man was actually an accomplice of the experimenter, and the drawing was rigged so that he was always the learner. The participant teacher was then instructed to administer shocks from 15 to 450 volts to the learner each time the learner made an error. Labels under the shock switches ranged from slight shock through danger severe shock to XXX. The experimenter explained that the teacher was to administer shocks in ascending 15-volt magnitudes, 15 volts the first time the learner made an error, 30 volts the next time, and so on. The teacher was given a 45-volt shock, so he would have an idea of how painful the shocks would be. What he didn't know was that the learner, who was in another room, was not actually being shocked. The Milgram experiment. To examine the role of social influence, Stanley Milgram set up a study in which participants believed they were testing a learner, actually Confederate, and punishing him with shocks when he gave them the wrong answer. A. Milgram's shock machine. B. The participant and experimenter attaching electrodes to the learner before testing begins. Most participants became concerned as the shock levels increased and turned to the experimenter to ask what should be done, but the experimenter insisted they go on. The first time a teacher expressed reservations, he was told, "Please continue." If the teacher balked, the experimenter said, "The experiment requires that you continue." If the teacher continued to hesitate, the experimenter said, "It's absolutely essential that you continue." If necessary, the experimenter escalated to, "You have no other choice, you must go on." If the participant asked whether the learner could suffer permanent physical injury, the experimenter said, "Although the shocks may be painful, there is no permanent tissue damage, so please go on." In the end, despite the learner's groans, pleas, screams, and eventual silence, as the intensity of the shocks increased, 80% of the participants continued past the 150-volt level, at which point the learner mentioned that he had a heart condition and screamed, "Let me out of here." Fully 62.5% of the participants went all the way to the 450-volt level, delivering everything the shock generator could produce. The average amount of shock given was 360 volts, after the learner let out an agonized scream and became hysterical. Milgram and other experts did not expect nearly as many participants to continue to administer shocks as long as they did. A panel of 39 psychiatrists predicted that only 20% of the participants would continue past the 150-volt level, and that only 1% would continue past the 330-volt level. Milgram's study and its implications are described in more detail in Chapter 9. For now, the important question is, what made the participants in Milgram's study engage in behavior that they believed was causing another person immense physical pain and, despite the experimenter's insistence, possible permanent harm as well? Milgram's participants were not heartless fiends. Instead, the situation was extraordinarily effective in getting them to do something that would normally fill them with horror. The experiment was presented as a scientific investigation, an unfamiliar situation for most participants. The experimenter explicitly took responsibility for what happened. Adolf Hitler frequently made similar pledges during the years he marched his nation into a world war and the Holocaust. Moreover, participants could not have guessed at the outset what the experiment involved, so they were not prepared to resist anyone's demands. And as Milgram stressed, the step-by-step nature of the procedure was undoubtedly crucial. If the participant didn't quit at 225 volts, then why quit at 255? If not at 420, then why at 435? Seminarians as Samaritans. A classic experiment by John Darley and Daniel Batson, 1973, demonstrates the power of the situation even more simply. These investigators asked students at the Princeton Theological Seminary about the basis of their religious orientation to determine whether particular students were primarily concerned with religion as a means toward personal salvation, or were more concerned with religion for its other moral and spiritual values. After determining the basis of their religious orientation, the psychologist asked each young seminarian to go to another building to deliver a short sermon. The seminarians were told what route to follow to get there most easily. Some were told that they had plenty of time to get to the building where they were to deliver the sermon, and some were told that they were already late and should hurry. On the way to deliver their sermon, on the topic of the Good Samaritan, by the way, each of the seminarians passed a man who was sitting in a doorway with his head down, coughing and groaning, and in apparent need of help. It turned out that the nature of religious orientation was of no use in predicting whether the seminarians would offer assistance. But as you can see in Figure 1.1, whether seminarians were in a hurry or not was a very powerful predictor. The seminarians were pretty good Samaritans as a group, but only when they weren't in a rush. Figure 1.1. The power of the situation and helping. Princeton seminarians usually helped the victim if they were not in a hurry, but rarely helped if they were in a rush. So, in a hurry, 10% of seminarians offered help, and not in a hurry, over 60% of seminarians offered help. The fundamental attribution error. People are thus governed by situational factors, such as whether they are being pressured by someone or whether they are late, more than they tend to assume. At the same time, internal factors, the kind of person someone is, have much less influence than most people assume they do. You may be surprised by many of the findings reported in this book because most people underestimate the power of the external forces that operate on an individual and tend to assume, often mistakenly, that the causes of behavior can be found mostly within the person. Psychologists call internal factors dispositions, that is, beliefs, values, personality traits, and abilities that guide behavior. People tend to think of dispositions as the underlying causes of behavior, but that's not necessarily true. Seeing an acquaintance give $1 to a beggar may prompt us to assume that the person is generous, but subsequent observations of the person in different situations might show that we had overgeneralized from a single act. Noticing a stranger in the street behaving angrily, we might assume that the person is aggressive or ill-tempered. Such judgments are valid far less often than we think. Dispositions. Internal factors, such as beliefs, values, personality traits, and abilities that guide a person's behavior. The failure to recognize the importance of situational influences on behavior, together with the tendency to overemphasize the importance of dispositions, was labeled the fundamental attribution error by Lee Ross, 1977. Many findings in social psychology indicate that people should look for situational factors that might be affecting someone's behavior before assuming that the person has dispositions that match the behavior. As you read this book, you will become more attuned to situational factors and less inclined to assume that behavior can be fully explained by characteristics inherent in the individual. The ultimate lesson of social psychology is thus a compassionate one. Social psychology encourages us to look at another person's situation, to try to understand the complex field of forces acting on the individual, in order to fully understand the person's behavior. Nudge, don't push. Kurt Lewin, 1952, introduced the concept of channel factors to help explain why certain circumstances that appear unimportant on the surface can have great consequences for behavior, either facilitating it or blocking it. The term is also meant to reflect that such circumstances can sometimes guide behavior in a particular direction by making it easier to follow one path rather than another. The concept has been borrowed by behavioral economics, a new field at the intersection of social psychology and economics. Behavioral economists refer to the concept as nudges, small, innocuous-seeming prompts that can have big effects on behavior. Fundamental attribution error. The failure to recognize the importance of situational influences on behavior, along with the corresponding tendency to overemphasize the importance of dispositions on behavior. Consider a study by Howard Leventhal and his colleagues on how to motivate people to take advantage of preventive care. 1965, they attempted to persuade Yale students to get tetanus inoculations. To convince them that the inoculation was in their best interest, the researchers had them read scary materials about the number of ways a person could get tetanus, in addition to the proverbial rusty nail. To make sure they had the students' full attention, the team showed them photos of people in the last stages of lockjaw. But not to worry, the students could avoid this fate simply by going to the student health center at any time and getting a free inoculation. Interviews showed that most participants formed the intention to get an inoculation, but only 3% did so. Other participants were given a map of the Yale campus with a circle around the health center and were asked to review their weekly schedule and decide on a convenient time to visit the center and the route they would take to get there. Bear in mind that these were seniors who knew perfectly well where the health center was. The fundamental attribution error. If you knew that a theology student had come across this person, who was coughing and groaning, and passed the person by without offering to help, what would you think of the student? Would you regard the student as an uncaring person? Or would you assume that some situational factor, such as being late for an appointment, caused the student to rush past without stopping to help? If you're like most people, you would probably jump to an unfavorable conclusion about the student's personality. Nevertheless, the nudge increased the percentage of students getting an inoculation ninefold to 28%. The tetanus shot nudge was employed in the Obama campaign's Get Out the Vote phone drive on election eve in 2008. Voters were asked, "Where will you be just before you vote?" And after the voters' answer, "What route do you plan to use to get there?" This procedure is now considered best practice, and both Republicans and Democrats use it. As we've noted, the nudge concept is central to behavioral economics. For example, economists have encouraged businesses to get as many of their employees as possible to participate in retirement plans, in which the employer puts money away for the employee's retirement. Rather than have their employees opt in to their retirement programs by checking a box or signing a statement saying they wish to be enrolled in the retirement plan, employers create an easy channel for participation by having it be automatic. Employees must check a box or sign a statement saying they don't want the retirement plan, otherwise they are automatically enrolled. Figure 1.2. How to have a happy retirement. If the box on your new employee form asks the question on the left, you are much more likely to be enrolled in the company's retirement plan than if the box asks the question on the right. Question on the left. If you do not wish to take part in the retirement plan funded in part by the company, please indicate that by checking the box below. The question on the right. If you wish to take part in the retirement plan funded in part by the company, please indicate that by checking the box below. This trivial-seeming nudge creates far more participation and far happier retirements than when the nudge conspires against participation. And did you know that 99% of Austrians allow for harvesting their organs for transplant, whereas only 12% of Germans allow harvesting? Before you commit the fundamental attribution error, we hasten to tell you that Germans have to check a box if they want to have their organs harvested. Austrians have to check a box if they don't want their organs harvested. Looking back, situations are often more powerful in their influence on behavior than we realize. Whether or not people are kind to others, and whether or not they take action in their own best interest, can depend on subtle aspects of the situation. We often overlook such situational factors when we try to understand our own behavior, or that of others, and we often mistakenly attribute behavior to presumed dispositions, the fundamental attribution error. If you are like most people, then like most people, you don't know you're like most people. Social psychologist Dan Gilbert. The role of construal. Look at figure 1.3. Gestalt principles and perception. When viewing this figure, known as the Canizza triangle, people fill in the empty spaces in their mind and perceive a white triangle. Do you see a white triangle? Most people do, but in fact there is no white triangle. We construct a triangle in our mind out of the gaps in the picture. The gaps are located just where they would be if a triangle were laid over the outlined triangle and a portion of each of the three circles. That makes a good, clear image, but it's entirely the creation of our perceptual apparatus and our background assumptions about the visual world. Both the perceptual process and the assumptions are automatic and non-conscious. That is to say, we're not consciously aware of them. Now look at Slave Market with Disappearing Bust of Voltaire, the above painting by surrealist artist Salvador Dali. Dali was a master at using the mind's tendency to construct meaningful figures from the gaps in an image. He created a number of well-known double images, pictures that could be perceived in two different ways, as in this painting. Gestalt Principles in Art. In his Slave Market with Disappearing Bust of Voltaire, Salvador Dali confronts the viewer with the bust of the French philosopher Voltaire at center of painting. But on closer inspection, Voltaire's head consists of the gap in the wall behind the two Dutch women in the marketplace, what artists refer to as negative space, and his face consists of the women themselves. We don't see things as they are, we see them as we are. Anais Nin. Interpreting reality. Our perceptions normally bear a resemblance to what the world is really like, but perception requires substantial interpretation on our part and is subject to significant bias under certain conditions. What we see is not necessarily what is actually there, but what is plausible, what makes a good, predictable figure in light of the stored existing representations we have of the world, and in light of the context in which we encounter something. German psychologists in the early part of the 1900s convincingly argued for this view in the case of visual perception. The theoretical orientation of those psychologists centered on the concept of Gestalt, German for form or figure. The basic idea of Gestalt psychology is that objects are perceived not by means of some passive and unbiased perception of objective reality, but by active, usually unconscious, interpretation of what the object represents. The belief that we see the world directly, without any complicated perceptual or cognitive machinery, doctoring the data, is referred to by philosophers and social psychologists as naive realism. Gestalt psychology, based on the German word Gestalt, meaning form or figure, an approach that stresses the fact that people perceive objects not by means of some automatic registering device, but by active, usually unconscious, interpretation of what the object represents as a whole.